Welcome everybody to our latest session in the series on Marxism, still relevant? The answer is yes. But tonight we're looking at the question, the women's question, Marx and the women's question, which is a subject that has been brought up in the discussion in some of the series actually. So we hadn't originally planned it because Marx actually didn't write a lot about the women's questions. However, other Marxists did. And we thought because with the International Women's Day just happened and the fact how it's been taken on by the establishment and turned almost into its opposite, it gave us the idea that we should really look at how Marxists and the workers' movement have established International Women's Day. And we're very pleased to have two expert speakers tonight on this issue. The first one is Ben Lewis, who's a historian and translator, and he does a lot of excellent work, and I'm going to put the link into the chat later on, in translating original material from German into English. So there's lots of things that has never been published before, and Ben is bringing that to a wider international audience, really. And you can actually support his work. He's on a website called Patreon, I think it's called, and I'm going to post the link later on. And he's done some excellent work on translating a report, for example, by Clara Zetkin on the Second International, I think it's the Copenhagen Congress, Ben will talk about that, which established International Women's Day. So it's about time we reclaim that for our movement. So we're very pleased to have him as the first speaker, and he's going to share some slides as well. Take it away, Ben. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah. Is it loud and clear? Let me just, okay, that should hopefully be visible.
It is.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. As Tina said, the immediate occasion, as it were, is International Women's Day, March the 8th, this past Monday. And as Tina also pointed out, I've been looking at taking a bit of a closer look at the International Socialist Women's Movement, which, as we'll see in a second, was the kind of the motivator, the originator of the original International Working Women's Day, which was first celebrated on March the 19th, actually in 1911. So what I wanted to do in terms of the question of Marxisms, and the women's question is take less of a theoretical approach, I suppose, although maybe some of the questions that are raised will come up in discussion, and more of a broadly historical one. As Tina said, I'm mainly interested in the history of German social democracy, 1871 to 33, broadly speaking. But as we'll see in a second, this movement that I will proceed to discuss, even while it had its centers in Germany of that time and in German social democracy, it really reached far across the world. And if you want a nice illustration of that, a nice place to begin, this is St. Petersburg, March 8th. I'm not sure exactly the corresponding date in the Russian calendar, 1917, huge demonstration of women on International Women's Day. One result of those efforts in 1910 that we'll look at. So I can't quite, there we go, I can see it now. From theory to practice, this is a very famous quote by Clara Zetkin, who in a sense can be seen as probably one of the most important people behind the emergence of International Women's Day. Maybe that's even an understatement. She's probably the central figure behind these developments. She says, women's propaganda must touch upon all those questions which are greater importance to the general proletarian movement. The main task is, indeed, to awaken women's class consciousness and to incorporate them into the class struggle. I'll discuss the kind of ramifications of that quote in a second. Tina mentioned Bebel and Engels. There were lots of other writers as well that took up this question from a more broadly theoretical perspective, a lot of whom haven't been translated, unfortunately, but there was a kind of ongoing discussion on the nature of the woman question as it was known at the time. From a theoretical, historical, and kind of almost anthropological approach, which is quite interesting. Like if comrades are interested, I'm happy to list some of the people that wrote on this. Heinrich Kuno, Rosa Luxemburg wrote a lot on it as well, in terms of kind of ancient societies and clan mode, etc. Lots of questions that are thrown up from engagement with Engels's text in particular. So that's what we often think of. Those are often our starting point for thinking about Marxism and the women's question. But as I said, I want to look at really how the theoretical ideas that were kind of broadly outlined in those texts and within the social democratic movement at the time actually took flesh and kind of became something real, even though that's largely been forgotten to many of us today, and many of us may not actually be aware of it. A key date here is the founding of the Second International in 1889, where Zetkin and a handful of other women comrades get together. Zetkin makes a speech arguing that women need to be incorporated into the class struggle. They need to be organized in the social democratic parties that are starting to form and grow massively at this time. And she wins the day on that, which was a break with more traditional guild forms of the labor movement, particularly in Germany, where women were often seen as competition. And in a very narrow economic sense, not incorrectly either, from the standpoint of narrow trade union jobs, etc. And so there was this kind of idea that women, well, they should stay in the household, etc. But Zetkin says it's not only inevitable that capitalism will draw women into the workplace, it's actually a good thing. The question is then, how do we organize them and how do we proceed as part of the struggle for socialism, which is reflected in that quote there. So I talked about the familiarity with the theoretical text, looking at the movement itself. It is worth emphasizing. I keep doing this whenever I speak at these forums, but it is worth emphasizing just how influential this movement was, right? And the International Women's Day, established in 1910, is just kind of the tip of the iceberg in this, because I'll talk largely about the German movement because it's what I know most about, but really this was an international movement that organized and brought into activity hundreds of thousands of women. The first celebration of International Workers' Women's Day in 1911 brought something like 1 million people onto the streets, mainly in Europe, where it was organized. So you start to see that these ideas that kind of broadly developed through the organizations of the working class movement, which is growing in confidence and growing in organization, they really start to take on organizational form and reach masses of people. Zetkin in particular is partly alluded to in the quote that you can see next to a picture there. She's motivated by the idea that women, the best way to achieve women's progress is for women to be organized in the labor movement alongside men. Now, she recognizes that there are issues with that. There are questions of prejudice, of old ideas, etc., etc. But she argues that really it's the working class movement, it's the social democratic movement, which for her the same synonymous really, that must take the lead in the struggle for women's liberation. And that was always a kind of unflinching feature of her politics that in part also made her slightly unpopular with what she would call the women's rightists of the time. Many educated women who, for example, or middle class women who wanted the same rights as middle-class educated professional men. So they wanted access to the universities, etc. They wanted the right to vote in the way that wealthier men had the right to vote through the suffrage system, through the tiered suffrage. And Zetkin was absolutely scathing of these people. While she said that they raise quite important issues about equality, and it's wrong that women can't get access to universities, it's wrong that women can't vote, they do so in a way which reflects their narrow class interests. And indeed, she says it's a fable. Is the term that she uses. It's a fable that women of all classes share the same interests, and beyond that, she says, when women educated middle-class women, richer women achieve more equality and status in capitalist society, it's not then the case that they go, oh, and now we turn to the working women. Actually, it was kind of the opposite. So that's her kind of approach. She draws on the insights of Marx and Bebel in particular, but her approach really is informed by the politics of social democracy, class independence, class hegemony, the working class taking the lead. So women's rightism, Frauenrechterei in German, it's a pejorative term for what in that time could be called the feminist movement, I suppose. The really important step. There was a key women's publication of German social democracy by the time, edited by Emma Ihre, called Die Arbeiterin, the female worker. But in 1891, with the Erfurt Congress and the establishment of the New Party program, which I talked about in my last talk here, link there or whatever, the party decides that actually it would be really good now, as the party's growing, to have targeted agitation and propaganda for a female audience, many of whom are stuck at home. And indeed, many of whom do not have the right to vote, but to organize in a legal way, right? Organize legally. So following Zetkin and her comrades, and through the publication of Die Gleichheit, there are networks established throughout Germany, built on trusted people, as they're called. Trusted men was the classic term in German social democracy, but obviously it doesn't apply here. Trusted people who use their networks to organize women, basically semi-legally, and draw women into politics. And that only changes in 1906 across Germany as a whole. So Zetkin edits the Die Gleichheit. I put here hidden treasure because it is a treasure, and it is indeed hidden. I doubt many people here would have read anything from the Die Gleichheit, at least consciously. I've done a few pieces from it in the past. If you've seen the Clara Zetkin Letters and Writings book, there are a few pieces from Die Gleichheit there, but broadly speaking, this will be unknown even to the far left today, let alone, you know, the kind of broader celebrations of International Women's Day last Monday. And as I say, this is a fortnightly magazine established in established in 1891, full title, Equality Magazine for the Interests of Female Workers, set up in 1891 as part of the party apparatus. So the SPD is kind of famous for the fact that it presides over hundreds of publications, from academic publications, women's publications, sporting publications, local newspapers, etc. This is part of that whole arsenal, as it were. And Zetkin is the editor. Truly remarkable publication. You'll see, I've got this further on the slide, but if you look up to the top left there on the slide, the third line down, it says, with the attachments, with the supplements, right? So there's two supplements in this particular issue from 1911, for our mothers and housewives. Okay, we can discuss that. And for our children. So it's not just a question of the political agitation that's going on in the newspaper, but also special supplements were produced for women who are stuck at home, and also for their children, which is quite interesting. So there's a lot of material there, cartoons, etc., and ideas that they have for, you know, educating young children who are stuck at home, you know, with their mothers largely, etc. So it's quite a remarkable kind of endeavor. It's politically significant in a number of ways. One of the most important in kind of this short summary I'll give of it is the fact that it runs throughout World War I as effectively a factional journal against the pro-war policies of the SPD leadership. So Zetkin uses the publication and the international links that have formed around it over the past 20 odd years to fight against the policies of the fight against World War I, and to fight against the policies of the SPD, the so-called fortress peace policies of going along with that war, which is very interesting. Also, you can see here that it was usually printed in 4 pages with 4 columns of tiny writing, right? So it's theoretically dense too. There's a lot to it over 25 years, a lot of material. And as I say, we're only really starting to scratch the surface of it, and there's a lot more to come. And I really look forward to that kind of work. At its peak, it's estimated that in Germany alone, around 200,000 women were organized through the SPD women's organizations and publication. And it's also worth stressing that as the leading body and the leading publication of the international socialist women's movement, it was also a kind of a posting board or a reporting center for activities going on amongst women in the struggle for women's rights all over the world. So that's a figure I keep coming across in my searches at the moment, is Alexandra Kollontai. Obviously writing about Russia, but not always from Russia, largely not from Russia, actually. Dora Montefiore was a founding member of the CPGB, radical woman talking about the situation here in Britain, Sweden, the Netherlands, etc., etc. So largely established internationally. This edition is the one on the 13th of March 1911. So this is the kind of last publication before the very first May Day itself. So it's calling on comrades, working women and girls, right? Come out onto the streets on the 19th of March. It's your day. I talked about the supplements and the housewives exclamation mark, and it says, the opening there, our day in March. We're certain that March 19th will become an important date in the history of the struggle for female suffrage. So that was kind of the way in which this was packaged. It was a day solely for women's political activity and agitation amongst women, kind of hooked on the immediate question that faced the International at the time, was basically fighting for the equality, for universal suffrage for all, with equal votes, including women. And that was a demand that went back to 1889. And indeed, it is realized for the first time in the wake of the revolutions after World War I, Germany, Austria, etc., where women not only can vote, but they stand for parliament and get successfully elected, Zetkin being one of them. Lots of Austrian delegates, social democratic delegates for the first time, etc., etc. So quickly, this is the last slide, just quickly on Copenhagen 1910, the conference of International Socialist Women that passes the resolution to introduce a Women's Day dedicated to political and agitational work amongst women in particular. It's introduced by Zetkin, Kitta Dunker, and a woman here on the left called Louisa Zietz. And they've been preparing this for a while. It does have, that shouldn't be there, sorry, it should be one down, meets before the Congress of the Second International, which meets, I think, the day after this one concludes. And this has got a bit of a long backstory. It's not dissimilar to May Day, in that many of the motivations for establishing such a day actually came from America. The Socialist Party of USA was kind of central in this, and had some incredibly important female organizers and worker organizers, which you can read about in the article that Tina mentioned. I'll link it below in more detail. And there was always this kind of discussion of, okay, we've got this situation. We now recognize there's a need for some kind of Women's Day. They have a National Women's Day in 1909 in the USA, organized by the SPUSA. But it's a largely isolated event, and the comrades from the Socialist Women's Movement America, who are present in Copenhagen in 1910, they're obviously in exchange with Zetkin and the others to say, okay, can we establish such a day internationally, and can we pull it off organizationally? Will it be a flop or not? And there's a realization in 1910 that yes, this is actually the time that we can do it and go forward, and that's where it comes from. Just a few quick points. The article will be linked, and it's, again, I think it's probably the first time that the official report of this foundational significant Congress has been translated into English. There are lots of reports of the Copenhagen events in terms of the international, etc. But not of this particular Congress. So that's significant in itself. Again, hidden treasure, buried treasure. And there's a number of debates which are quite interesting in that they're of their time. They're both of their time, and in a sense, they speak to us still today, or they echo down to our movement, I would argue. So, for example, on the resolution on the need for universal female suffrage, some delegates led by Fabians and the ILP in Britain actually want to remove a passage that condemns restricted female suffrage, which is to say, female suffrage through the existing property qualifications of voting. So if you're a wealthy woman, you get a strong vote, but female workers will not, right? And they kind of defend that ideologically and politically as a step forward, as a step towards something better in that kind of classical Fabian way. And Zetkin, I think, Tina said she wrote this article. I think that's the case. It's not proven yet, but it certainly bears her fingerprints, as it were, in terms of its polemical style, its no-nonsense style. But of course, she wasn't the only one at the time who wrote in that way. So it's still up in the air. But whoever writes this article is scathing of these people. And it's really worth a read for that level, because again, it speaks to this question of, which particular class interests of workers, of women are being advanced, how are they being done so, and what should be the response of the socialist movement, at a time when basically International Women's Day is, women can be just as good at bombing kids or exploiting the workers, right? That's what it's become, as Tina alluded to earlier on. Zetkin called this approach das Damenwahlrecht, ladies suffrage, right? So this for the well-to-do ladies. There's also, just to conclude, there's a really interesting discussion on night work for women. And you would think that the Marxist approach, or Zetkin's approach, would be, well, yes, women also have a right to, work whenever they see fit, etc. But it's quite interesting because Scandinavian, there's a motion from, I think, Danish and Swedish comrades, members of the Socialist Women's International, who say, well, if we ban night work for women, that basically puts a whole lot of people out of work. It worsens the situation of women, and I think these are typesetters, so they work at night. And Zetkin says, well, this is just trade unionism. This is a guild approach. And I think the motivation, again, this is how you have to understand things in their time, a bit like the housewife situation as well. I think the motivation behind it was that in their role as women, in the traditional role as women, in terms of, having children and being in the household, night work is terrible for all of us. I mean, there's no scientific doubt about that, but particularly affected women in terms of child rearing capacity and things like that. Which obviously from today's standpoint is ridiculous. Like, what that's just utterly sexist to say, well, we can't ban night work because you can't, some things need to run at night. But we should ban it for women. I mean, that would be seen as kind of ridiculous, but that's an interesting debate that takes place on that. And then there's a report of how the International Secretariat will continue to meet, etc. And it does so, as I said before, in the throughout the war, and became a rallying point of international opposition. And as we saw in the first slide, February 1917, it's actually one of the events as a product of this organization, as a product of this struggle over many years, that in a sense becomes the catalyst for what happens in the Russian Revolution. That's the link to the article. There's some more information there. And I think I will stop there because I want to let Anne, she's got a lot more to say on this than me. So I thought let Anne come in for a lot longer today and give her views on a more theoretical perspective. This is just the kind of immediate historical backdrop to International Women's Day. And if you would like to hear and read more, then as Tina said, please give me a follow. And yes, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Ben. Don't leave, because we will be asking you questions and have contributions later in the Q&A. Before I bring in Anne, I thought I share something which I put on Facebook, but it make me laugh so much, which is how the Sun celebrates International Women's Day with Kate bloody Middleton, the opposite of the kind of women we strive to be. Jesus Christ, that made me laugh so hard. Okay, just a little anecdote there in terms of how they've remade Women's Day. Okay, I'm very pleased to have Anne McShane now next, also a historian. Am I introducing you as a historian? Is that right? Introduce yourself, Anne.
Okay. Well, so I should speak now, yeah?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, what would I describe myself as? Well, I'm a communist. I'm a communist who've been active for many years in Britain and now in Ireland. And I'm somebody who was always interested in the woman question. And I asked a lot of questions when I was in the CPGB in Britain about, what was the situation for women in the Soviet Union? What was the reality for them? And most comrades said to me that basically, as far as they understood, that while legal equality had been put in place and important laws passed in relation to the family and other issues affecting women, little in reality had changed. On coming back to Ireland, I've worked as a solicitor, and my boss put me on a 4-day week about 10 years ago. And I think my husband hoped that I might get a second job, but luckily another comrade facilitated me applying to do a PhD on the women's question in the Soviet Union. And I've studied the Zhenotdel, which was the communist women's organization, which was created in 1919 and closed down by Stalin in 1930. And like Ben mentions, buried treasure, and that was exactly how I felt when I started to translate the articles from the journal Kommunistka, which was the journal of the movement, to see that actually, far from it being something which was really sterile, really just, you know, on paper, that there had been enormous attempts to make real the programmatic commitment to women's emancipation. Anyway, so I hope not to speak for more than 20 minutes, because I think it would be better to allow more discussion and questions. So the women of the Zhenotdel, Bolshevik women, and then also the women that Ben described as taking part in the Second International Women's Movement, and then also the women who took part in the Communist Women's Movement, which was an organization that was created in 1920. They all were committed to the struggle for women's emancipation as part of the struggle for socialism. I myself reject the idea that these women were socialist feminists, not because they were, not fighters for women's emancipation. In fact, they were very fiercely committed to the question. But the fact is that they didn't hold with any form of feminism. They believed that feminism was a sectional question, which I think remains the case today, and that the struggle for women's emancipation can be found in Marxism. I know that people today say sometimes, well, that was back then, when the feminists then were like the ladies, you know, who campaigned like for suffrage and suffrage alone for a certain layer of women, and that today we have socialist feminism. But for me, I think the reason we have socialist feminism today is that the left, the communist movement, and the left in general really neglected this question after 1930. And I think that in the period 1970s, like socialist feminism was created as a way to deal with the issue of to represent women who are socialists and attach the question of women's emancipation to socialism. But I believe that it basically doesn't do anything to further our struggle for women's emancipation within socialism, and indeed oftentimes clouds the question and leads us down a lot of other alleys, which are like not relevant to our struggle. Anyway, I just want to say a little bit about Marx, Engels, and Bebel on the woman question, because that's, as I first said, that's where they situated their ideas. So as Tina said, Marx himself did not write a lot directly on the woman question. However, I do think that you can really situate the question of the need for women's emancipation within his writings on nature and many other questions. For instance, Marx writes about the necessity to overcome alienation, and the fact that we as human beings are alienated from nature under class society and under capitalism. That's something that's been discussed in earlier seminars. And no more important than that, obviously, is the fact that not only are we alienated from nature, but we're alienated from each other. And so human beings are not only alienated from members of their own sex or gender, but they're alienated most profoundly from each other. Men are alienated from women, and that is a question that needs to be resolved. And Marx paraphrased I think it was Charles Fourier, I could be wrong on this, who said that the level of culture and progress of any given society is reflected in how women are treated by that society, what rights they have, what kind of agency they have in that society. In the Communist Manifesto, the woman question is only mentioned, you know, not in passing, but very briefly, where they describe the manner in which women and children are being drawn into the workforce, and the barbarity of their conditions, the fact that they've been used for the most dangerous forms of work, and that they are receiving a much lower wage than men. And then in another point that I'll just mention is Marx in his involvement in drafting the program of the Parti Ouvrier, included in his demands for the ending of all of the articles of the Napoleonic Code, which established women as lesser than men. So I'm just now going to come on to talk about the work of Louis Henry Morgan and the interest that Marx and Engels and also other people like Rosa Luxemburg, Ben mentioned, had in this work. And what this was about was examining the work of this man who you may have heard of, who was an anthropologist and who had lived among the Iroquois Indians in the United States. And he had studied this society that he lived in, and he'd written a book which was based on development of different kind of categories of society, you know, how society had developed from, he would have put from savagery to barbarisms to patriarchy to civilization. In any event, the Marx and Engels and others were interested in his work, not particularly because of that, but because of the descriptions that he included and the research he did on the status of women within those societies. So Marx did study the question, and he wrote about it in his notes, which have not been published in English, but I believe are going to be published in English, if not already done, but should be done soon, which will be very interesting for us. Engels then, following Marx's death, wrote about the question in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. And I'm sure most comrades will be familiar with that book. Now, I think it's important to say that this book that was written by Engels was not meant to be the last word on the question. He really was hoping to rise again on the question, but it was a way of summarizing Morgan's views, Marx's views, you know, were developing from his notes, and his own views, and putting something down. It's been criticized as being very deterministic, and Marx is said to have a more nuanced approach to the role of women within primitive communism and later societies, which is one reason I think why it would be very interesting to read the translation of Marx's notes when they're available. So basically, I've already mentioned the Iroquois Indians. So the Iroquois Indians at the time when Morgan did his research, their society was organized as like pairing families, pairing couples, pairing families. But the manner in which people addressed each other, men and women addressed each other and their children, reflected an earlier form of the family, according to Morgan's view, and Engels and Marx, share that view. So basically, a woman member of this tribe would refer to her sister's children as her daughters, her sister's sons as her sons, but her brothers' children she would call her nephews and nieces. So there was a division. The children, you know, it's like a matriarchal division of you know who you're related to. You were related to the woman, the matriarch. That was how you would trace back your birth. So Engels, in his setting out of his basic categories, his stages of development of society and the family, sets out the following categories. The first he describes as consanguine marriage, where except for generational divisions, all of the men and the women in the tribe, in the clan, are all married to each other. There isn't, you know, basically you can have sex with any other member of the tribe who is in the same generation as you, and that would include brothers and sisters. Then he says that this gave way at some stage to the Punaluan family, whereby more taboos were introduced in terms of who you could sleep with, who you could have sex with. And basically at that stage, you wouldn't, the kind of basically they put restrictions on sleeping or having sexual relations with immediate family members. But this was a form of group marriage still. Then this gave way at a certain stage to a form of pairing marriage, where basically this coincided with the first development of property. So within early communism, the belief is that women basically managed the household, that women were the gatherers, and men were the hunters. Okay, so then when society developed to a point where there started to be a surplus, it was men that were in charge of the cattle breeding, and women were outside of this. They were still involved in the communist household, and they were still the matriarchs. However, with the development, and this is being very crude about it, sorry for this, but within the development of the surplus, then women became excluded, because they did not have ownership of that surplus that belonged to men. And then there was a major shift within the form of the family at the time. And there was what Engels calls the historic defeat of the female sex, as patriarchy replaced matriarchy, and where the necessity of the men to own their surplus meant that they wanted to ensure that they knew that their child was their child. So basically, you understand, how those kind of forms have come into being, where there was legitimacy and illegitimacy established, where basically there was monogamy, monogamous marriage developed, but it was monogamy for women, not monogamy for men. So basically the man would want to know that she had only been with him, and she was to be restricted to that. Then it seems that the category of the patriarchal family, which I think I myself have seen in existence still in the early 20th century in Central Asia, and I'm sure people will tell me about other parts of the world where it continued to exist still, where there was a pairing marriage, but there was within the patriarchy, the men could have a number of wives, and women were essentially slaves, domestic slaves. They were not, they couldn't go out. They were more or less confined to the family home. Obviously, in parts of the Soviet Union where I've studied, they were secluded, they wore veils, but even within nomadic and other societies, women lived an extremely restricted life. And then he moved on to talk about the monogamous family under capitalism, which he argued was based on property. So he then looked at the undermining of the monogamous family by the development of the proletarian family, and argued that the fact that the proletarian family by and large didn't have property that could be inherited meant that it was being undermined by this. He also argued that the fact that women were working undermined it, and he very much believed that women entering into the workforce would create the basis for their liberation, and that it would do so in a very progressive manner, that as soon as women were in the workforce, basically, an enormous step forward had been made, and that I think he thought that working class men and trade unions would accept women into the workforce far more readily than they actually did. So in terms of what they believed the future would be, so basically, like, they took from these studies the understanding, firstly, that the family is not a permanent form of, not a permanent structure. It changes all the time. It's plastic, and that it's based on real social and material conditions. And they learned from early communist society, to the extent that they could understand it, to the extent that there was research available, that really the best way for a future communist society to organize was on the basis of collectivizing, socializing all the needs of society together. So while capitalism only values labor that produces profit and devalues work in the home and childcare and any of those other privatized forms of work which generally are left to women, socialist society and communist society would take those things into its own hands and give them, because it's a society that is motivated by need, would understand that those needs, to have a good childhood, or have proper nutrition, or all of these things, are as much a part of society's necessities as anything else. It's not a technical question, it's a social, political, and cultural question. I have a couple of quotes there that I think I probably won't go into now, because I'm perhaps a little bit over time already. Okay, so I just want to mention Bebel for a minute, because August Bebel, who was a very famous socialist and member of the German Reichstag, and one of the most important tribunes of the socialist movement, also engaged with Morgan and also wrote on the question. And the points that I mentioned about Engels in terms of foreseeing the kind of society of the future was written very eloquently by Bebel in Women and Socialism. Now, there's not everything you could say you would agree with, and he's a little bit, I suppose, reactionary on some questions and then very progressive on other questions. He's just very contradictory. But more or less what he does believe is this, that basically women in the future will be socially and economically free, and that they will be free in every way with men. And then on sexual freedom, and I think this is interesting, he argued that the gratification of the sexual instinct will be as a private concern and will be like the satisfaction of any other natural instinct. So basically that sexual relationships should not be shrouded in any morality. They should be simply what people want to do when they want to do it, and should be as natural as anything else. In fact, Alexander Kollontai wrote about this in the first years of the after the Russian Revolution, and Lenin was very condemnatory of it. He thought that it was, immoral, and he thought that it was kind of fetishizing sexual relations, and basically it was inappropriate at that time. However, I think that it was something that was a real question for women involved in the early communist movement, because obviously they did not want to feel that they were trapped within marriages anymore. And like Kollontai, Ines Armand, and others were very vocal on this question of sexual freedom and the belief that women should be able to, and men should be able to live whatever lives they wanted with whoever they wanted to, and for however long they wanted to, and that that there shouldn't be any need for people to be economically dependent on each other. And obviously economic freedom is extremely important. So with the Russian Revolution, there was the legal equality for women. And this was really like very radical, very revolutionary. I mean, it was unprecedented. And the Zhenotiel, which was the women's department of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee, actually came about as a result of initiatives by Bolshevik women, and supported by very many working class and peasant women in the early Russian Republic. There was a Congress in November 1918, which was a mass event far more women turned up than were expected, and that decided that they would start to take action to implement the commitment of the revolution to women's equality. As a result of those commissions, the party leadership decided to set up the Genotgel, and I've written on the Genotgel in the Weekly Worker, and people can go and read those articles if they're interested. And I describe a very problematic relationship between the Russian leaders of the Russian Revolution, the men, and the women's movement. But I think what is extremely important for us to see is how innovative this organization was and how much it did in the short time that it existed for. Something that I had not been aware of up to 10 years ago. So the Genotgel basically played a leading role in the task of socialization. So in setting up canteens, people will know that in the early years of the Russian Revolution, canteens were extremely popular. They also set up creche facilities, nurseries, education for women, huge literacy campaign. They had workplace inspections. Well, obviously they were very keen to recruit women to jobs, but they also wanted to make sure that they were safe. I do actually disagree with Ben on the question of night work, but I'm not going to go into that now. I think it actually is an important question. The emphasis they placed was women's health in the workplace, and that included nursing mothers, women with babies, like basically getting maternity leave, all of these questions. I mean, these were really important, but nothing had ever been done about them before. So they were like, we've got this theory, and now we're going to put it into practice. So I think that they had very many successes. Things went backwards with the introduction of new economic policy. A lot of women lost their jobs, and the organization continued until 1930. And even when it ended, even when Stalin closed it down, women tried to carry on with it because it was such an immense, for them, such an immense opportunity to act on the basis of their own beliefs and to do something which meant something in practice. And I think myself, it's an extremely important movement. The Communist Women's Movement, which was created in 1920, was led by Clara Zetkin, who Ben has spoken about, Inessa Armand, and Kollontai. And that itself is extremely interesting and little known about. But hopefully this year, there's going to be a book coming out, which was edited by Mike Tabor and Daria Dudakova, on the first two conferences of that women's communist movement. And in fact, myself and another woman, Lydia Hirsch, we did an interview with Daria Duanakova on the book, which will be shown on Cosmonaut in a couple of weeks' time. But it's really, really interesting. They had extremely lively debates and lots of differences and just remarkable. I mean, some of the slogans of the German women's movement were just like the kind of slogans we have today on women's right to choose our body, our own, which to me in the 1920s was quite remarkable. Yes, so I don't want to go on any longer, really. I mean, I think I've more or less covered the basics of what I wanted to talk about. One thing, though, I will say in closing is that I think it's a great shame that the writings of Babel and Engels and Morgan were more or less left there. I know that Ben says that Rosa Luxemburg wrote on them. Alexandra Kollontai also wrote. She tried to develop it, but she did tend to be a bit leftist, and she was often easily dismissed. But the project of developing those ideas really was left in 1920s, as far as I can see, in terms of Marxists doing it as Marxists. And I think that left us in a situation where the movement went backwards, where during the years of the communist parties, the official communism, really women didn't have many rights. And I know that, for instance, in the CPGB at the time, women just made the tea. a lot of the time women were not seen as, you know, equals, not really. And I think then that has left us weaker. And I think today it is an issue that we really must take up. So I think, like, to go back to the kind of arguments that were made by Clara Zetkin at the conferences of the Communist Women's Movement, we need to make sure that we integrate the woman's question into every aspect of our work, onto every committee, because the woman's question, because women's emancipation is not just something for women, it's something for us as a society as a whole. Unless you involve women as equals, as a part of our society in the struggle for revolution, we will be left in a similar situation as they were after the Russian Revolution, as the Communist Women's Movement was, where for the first time men were being challenged about this question, and they hadn't studied it, and they hadn't really kind of taken on board the questions. And I think that I want to say that when I say I'm not a feminist, it's not that I like hate feminists. I can completely understand why women consider themselves feminists in a situation where the socialist and the communist movement is saying very little on the question, or where they believe that it's an economic issue, that, or when we can afford to have women's rights, if when we can afford to have nurseries or women's education down the line in socialism, then we'll have it. No, that's not how it should be. It should be integrated in the question, in our struggle from the very beginning. And I leave there, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and fascinating. Both introductions, I think, were very, very good. There's a very vibrant discussion in the chat. Comrades, please consider coming into the meeting. That would help enormously, because it's quite difficult to read out questions and keep on top of everything. Ian has asked me to read something out, though, so I shall do it. Okay, basically the historic defeat of womankind. Quick question, you know, how to the massive counter revolution in our society. How did it come from, you know, from women in charge to men in charge? Basically, he's asking, is that something that happened just once, or did it happen in a number of places, a number of times? And does that not point to something, you know, that kind of perhaps had to happen or something like that? It's in the chat, so if comrades could read out that question. Ian, if I didn't do it justice, maybe come in and ask the question yourself. I thought it was fascinating, and taking away from that is the idea of the family, which is often seen as, you know, it's always been there, it always will be there. Of course, you need a mum and a dad and to bring up children, etc. It's actually a very modern thing, and can be and should be done away with if we're really in favor of women's liberation, I think. Clearly, I mean, if people want to stay together, you know, I'm not going to split them up, but as a construct, it is quite where it comes from, etc., is quite oppressing and quite limited in how we can live together. In the Communist Manifesto, I think Marx and Engels talked about Aufheben, the family structure, which you could try to translate. It's a bit difficult to translate, but it's something like overcoming or transcending. So they were not in favor of abolition of the family, but to transcend it into something better. And I think that's some of the things that Anne pointed at. You know, you have collectivity in society, you work together to raise children, etc., which is and to work together to help each other, and, you know, cook together, and etc., and which is a much better way to go about it. So I'm going to stop with this now, and I'm going to bring in some comrades who have raised their hand. First one was Carol.
Hi, thanks very much for letting me ask my question. I was very interested, Anne, in your discussion on feminism and socialism, because I sort of got the impression early on that you thought that the two of them were incompatible with each other. So I'd like you to maybe go into that in a bit more detail about your beliefs in the relationship between socialism and feminism. Thank you.
Short and sweet. Okay, then it's Kevin.
It's a question to both Ben and to Anne, and it's particularly about the sort of knowledge of the theories of the women's question that you refer to amongst socialists in both Russia, communists and socialists in Russia and in Germany. And I suppose it's part of a wider question that you raised, Ben, and Anne as well, about these publications and about the availability of Marxist theoretical work to the early socialist movement, and really the impact of this. You know, Anne makes the point that in the communist movement that despite the theoretical equality, that women were, quote, just making the tea. And I suppose I'm interested in whether this is an example where many people just sort of mouth slogans and haven't really read or thought or discussed, you know, the political implications. So I'm interested in what evidence we have about how far these movements and these ideas penetrated into the, you know, into the consciousness of activists. You know, Die Gleichheit is obviously a very impressive newspaper, but what was its readership, for example? And likewise with Bebel's Women and Socialism, you know, how many people read it and discussed it. So I'm interested in that, and I wonder if Anne, you could mention the same as well. You talk about numbers of women coming along to meetings and so forth. Was there, what sort of evidence do you have, particularly in your work on the Soviet Far East, about the resistance of male communists to female equality and indeed their views on the women's question? Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. Ian wants to read out his own question, I think. Sorry, Ian.
Hi, no, that's all right. I started off saying quick question, and pretty soon after I had to say sorry, maybe not so quick. But it's just something I will try and restrict myself as much as possible to focus it on the specifics that I'm interested in, on what I've put in the chat, because it's something that I've thought of before, especially in talks on this and articles on this subject that mentioned, as I think you did, Anne, that it sort of happened by accident, that the men happened to be in charge of the cattle when they became the first source of surplus. So this world historic defeat of womankind happened because of something so specific as that. Does that point to it happening at one point only and then spreading out? Or is it a very bad case of convergent evolution? And if it did evolve in disparate societies because they had similar pre-existing sexual divisions of labour, is that the thing that can be traced back to a single point in the very distant past, like before we spread out from Africa? And is there any reason why that came into being? So yeah, it's just something about the theory. I think it's a theory I subscribe to, but I'm trying to get a handle on whether it happened once or many times across a huge planet long before it became any kind of global village, or if it happened when we were still all together. But at that point, I don't think we'd been developing any surpluses when we were all together before we spread out around the world. So yeah, just what the theoretical thinking is on that. I'd be very interested. Thanks.
Tiny little question there, yes. Anne is not an anthropologist, I should say. There's been a couple of questions in the chat. Mark is asking, what do the speakers think about the campaign wages for housework? Or is that similar to, you know, the issue of ladies' suffrage? You know, is it a step in the right direction, or is it actually sort of institutionalizing inequality? Michael is asking, and a few people are asking, Anne, did we get you right? You are not a feminist. What's going on there? And Michael is asking, what did you mean when you talked about the socialist feminism of the 70s in a critical way? How do you both feel? Can I ask a few more questions, or do you want to come in now? You don't want to come in yet? Okay, then Steve Freeman next.
Yes, hi Anne and Ben, thank you. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, you wanted to come in, did you?
Yes, yeah, sorry.
Well, Anne, I meant.
Oh, sorry. Oh,
Anne,
sorry.
do you want to come in?
Well, I don't want to interrupt Steve, but yeah, whenever Steve finishes, if that's okay.
Okay, after Steve, I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no, sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. So thanks, Anne and Ben, for your introductions, and very thought-provoking as well in the things that you said. I want to take up a little bit the Carol question. This is the one that's also been posed to Anne, you see. So many men call themselves feminists. David Cameron did, Tony Blair did. And organizations on the left also call themselves feminists. I remember Left Unity that actually defines itself as a feminist organization. So it's quite difficult, therefore, to say that you're not a feminist, because it will easily be misunderstood or indeed misinterpreted. It might be, if you say you're not a feminist, people will think that what that means is you're anti-women, or you're a misogynist, or that you think women should be second-class citizens, etc., etc. And in some ways, therefore, it depends on what the word feminism actually means and what we understand by it. Now, I think there's two possible things it could mean. It could be a particular theory of women's liberation, in which the class struggle is replaced as a struggle between men versus women. And feminists usually take that view of what the basic dynamic is. Or it could simply mean women's liberation. Now, if feminism means women's liberation, then surely we've all got to be feminists. If it means a particular theory, maybe some of us are not feminists, but that doesn't mean we're anti-women's equality, anti-women's liberation. So I think it's a lot in what you mean by the term feminism. So I'm on Anne's side with this, but I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle as a man. But I think the connection is that what makes sense is not simply to counterpose feminism to communism, but actually to make the link with democracy. Because I think fundamentally this is what is the key thing that we have to look at. So I prefer to use the term of democracy, freedom and democracy. There can be no democracy without women's liberation. There can be no equality for anybody without women's liberation. Therefore, the fight for democracy is all about absolutely and totally bound up with the fight for women's liberation and equality. And the fight for democracy has to be conducted by classes, by the working class. And it has ultimately to end up in communism. So I think you can get to the idea of women's liberation through democracy, through democratic struggle, through democratic revolution, anti-communism, without necessarily calling yourself a feminist. But it's no good, by the way, if we as Democrats don't bother with the women's question and the feminists say whatever, it would be where Anne described it we got with Stalinism, we'd be there. So we can only be Democrats and put that argument forward if we are the best fighters for women's liberation, in other words, as men and as women. And what we emphasize is the unity of men and women together to fight for liberation. And if we are male chauvinists, if we don't do any of these things, then obviously we are not Democrats in any sense at all. We're chauvinists. So I think there is another way to get this. It always depends what we want to use. So I would agree with Anne. I wouldn't call myself a feminist, but I would call myself an extreme Democrat. And to be an extreme Democrat who looks to the working class as the force for equality, liberation, etc., and therefore making women's liberation central to what we're doing. Now, if you do that, people say, oh, you're a feminist then. But I just think that's what we mean by the term. So I'll leave it there. But I'm just asking Anne, maybe other comrades, how Anne do you see the term feminist when you say you're not a feminist? Is it along those lines? That's my question.
Find out. Hello, Anne.
Okay, yeah, I watched some of the chat there. Somebody said it was idiotic, but I don't know, something like that I didn't call myself a feminist. And I can completely see why you would think that. And actually, before I became a communist, I would have described myself as a feminist. And I think I am most certainly a women's liberationist. My problem is that I've thought about this a lot. I think I'm not sure that feminism adds anything to Marxism, because for me, I think Marxism is an emancipatory philosophy, set of ideas, economic, analysis. It's a way for society, for the working class to lead society to a communist society, to socialism. And within that, and that's what I tried to say at the beginning, within that, what you're talking about is revolutionizing all social relationships and emancipating all members of society. Therefore, women's emancipation as part of that is not a technical economic issue. It's not a question which, unfortunately, it was seen too often as, and continues to be seen too often as something that, well, when we have the money to organize a creche at a meeting, then we'll organize a creche at a meeting. Until then, it doesn't matter. Oh, we've got hardly any women at this meeting. Oh, well, that's just how things are. We'll sort it out later. No, I think it's a question that has to be addressed now. I think if you say you're for women's emancipation as part of your struggle for socialism, then you have to show that you are. And I think that my criticisms are mostly not so much of the feminists, but of the left at the time when the 1970s came, late 1960s and 1970s, and the struggle for women's emancipation and questions of, abortion rights and whatever came along. As far as I'm aware, the CPGB did not take up the question. The majority of the world communist movement was not involved in that question. And I'm saying, what if they had been? What if they had raised that question and worked and kind of taken that up in the way that the likes of Clara Zetkin and Collentine, people like that, argued at the Communist Women's? We would have done something that would have made it clear that socialists and communists are the ones that fight for women's emancipation. I think as well, although I know Steve says he considers himself a feminist, I don't think, in my view, most men in the socialist movement don't. And I think that sometimes what happens with feminism, although it makes very important critical points and raises very many important questions, but I think it's sectional. I think it doesn't universalize the struggle for women's emancipation, because I believe that what we need to do is for men to take up this question as a central aim themselves. And just one point I wanted to make, like in Ireland during the struggle for women's right to choose, I've described before to comrades how when at the very beginning of the campaign around the referendum, it was believed that younger men and older men would not support it because basically they wouldn't see, why women should do it, and they would be conservative on the question. But as the weeks went on, particularly with the entry of some American religious right into Ireland on social media and physically, there was a response, and basically older men in general said they were going to vote yes because they didn't think they should have any view or any, that was nothing to do with them. It was completely up to women and they didn't want to be involved in it. It was none of their business. And younger men on social media and in box pops or surveys at the time said that basically they wanted this right for their wives and their daughters. They didn't want them to live in a society which meant that if they got pregnant, they had to travel to a foreign country for an abortion. They made the question their own, and without the involvement of men in that struggle in the way they did, we would not have won the question. So really, that's all I'm trying to point out. I mean, I agree with Steve. If feminism is about women's emancipation, then that's fine. But I do think it's about very many different things. And I think like how it's usurped by the bourgeoisie with this week's Women's Day, the year's Women's Day, this Monday, you can see how it can be used as a kind of a gloss on the bourgeoisie to make it look as though they're for women's rights, when in actual fact, they're repressing the vast majority of women. So just then on the defeat of the female sex, well, actually it's been argued that Engels was very not only deterministic, but basically, wrong on that question. And I think that like the women, undoubtedly, I don't know when, and as Tina said, I'm not an anthropologist. I don't know when it would have happened, but certainly there was a switch from communal, communistic kind of tribal living to agriculture and cattle herding, and that move involved women losing status in society, very dramatically losing status in society. And I think that that is because of the fact that women were connected with a different form of production and social production and reproduction within society, and those things lost their value as there was a switch to private property. And then yeah, okay. Oh, Kevin, on the theories, it's interesting, that question of the theories, because I have read many of the women in the General Jail were familiar with Engels's ideas and with Babel's ideas. And the reason why is because Clara Zetkin popularized those ideas. She was obviously a contemporary of Babel's, and she spoke on the question. I mean, she was without doubt the leader of the entire project, and she made those available. But I think my view is that in the Russian movement is that there wasn't much interest in it. In the German movement, there was clearly more interest and more success, but I don't think there was much interest in the Russian movement. And on the campaign for wages for housework, well, I actually don't know what I think about that question. I think it would be better if we socialized the question so that somebody came in and did your housework rather than you got paid for staying at home, and then you could go out and enjoy yourself rather than doing what is, well, in my view, the most monotonous, task that you could be called about. I know some people like it, my sisters do, but I never have. If you come to my house, you'll see. Okay, thanks.
Ben, do you want to come in?
I'm happy to pass for now to have a bit more discussion, because I think there was only one question directly aimed at me, so I can deal with that later. Just have more people to discuss.
Okay, because we have quite a lot of people in the who want to ask questions. No okay, problem. Esther, please. Do you want to come in now? Oops.
Hello.
Oh, you're very dark.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I can see you even now.
Yeah. So the issue really is about property, isn't it? So my question really was about the subjugation of women, and I also refer to violence against women, and I don't think it's been discussed a great deal here this evening, and the fact that women are considered to become property, and that's a product of the end of communal living, a product of the fact that a woman becomes a property of her husband and therefore can be controlled by her. So do you correlate that subjugation and possibly violence as well with that end of the matriarchy and the move into patriarchy?
Thanks, Esther. Thank you. Okay, next person is Felicity, please. Can you start your camera, please, Felicity? Felicity, if you can hear us.
Yeah, hi. I'd rather not start my camera.
Okay, fine.
If that's okay. Yeah, well, for me, feminism does mean female emancipation. I can't see what else it would mean. And also, I'd like to know where within Leninism, Marxism, has women's emancipation been fully articulated or even incorporated? And you could still have a Marxist socialist state and still with groups being left behind. But my main question is, what of it? So therefore, it leads to what of intersectionality within modern Marxism? I think I've understood that you feel that that's not a valuable concept, but I'd still like to know. Thanks.
Thank you. Alan, next, please.
Yeah, just briefly to bring a few things together, which Anne mentioned there. I mean, this discussion about what feminism means and what socialism means, and is there a thing such as socialist feminism? It does, as I think Steve was saying, depend on what content you give those words. But generally speaking, isms tend to, in my understanding, tend to represent a broad understanding of how society can change. And historically, there's a large body of work which describes itself as feminism, which projects that social change in terms of the struggle of woman as woman, and tends to disappear the class. and this is manifest also to some extent in intersectionality, which, while it does mention class, it doesn't see it as central, which is part of what Marxism sees. It sees class as having a centrality. But it is interesting how the term feminism is used, because to use the example which Anne gave of the pro-choice struggle in Ireland, I would say that as someone who was quite heavily involved in that, not just at the time of the referendum, but prior to that, most of the participants, both men and women, would have called themselves feminists of some kind. And in the, particularly amongst younger people, there is a tendency to use the term as pretty much interchangeable with women's liberation. And that's a bit of a problem, because I think that there are feminists and they get to politically disguise themselves as being the representatives of women's liberation. And I would agree with, at the level of theory, there isn't anything, feminism doesn't add anything to Marxism. I'd agree with Anne's statement there. But there is a problem in that most organisations which all the people a lot in this meeting here and in the time we've been alive, most Marxist organisations have tended not to give that the centrality which Anne is arguing and Ben is arguing that it deserves, which I agree with. And that's a problem, because actually existing Marxism doesn't tend to do that. And this is interestingly, actually, to use that example of the Irish pro-choice movement, that's actually true of political organisations who now very proudly call themselves socialist feminists. The two biggest left organisations in Ireland, the SWP, as it was when I first arrived, before it dissolved itself into People for Profit, and the Socialist Party, who now describe themselves as socialist feminists and have various front groups explicitly calling themselves that, were not particularly strong advocates, shall we say, of women's right to choose until it became popular. Indeed, the SWP didn't even mention the question of women's oppression in their election material when I first arrived in Ireland. And the Socialist Party, for reasons of realism, did not call for women's right to choose, free abortion on demand, because they felt that it would be alienating of sections of the population. And it wasn't until that it became apparent after the unfortunate death of Savita Halapanova and the large outrage in society about that they suddenly came on board. But now that question has been resolved, even though the question of abortion rights has not been completely resolved in Ireland, they are no longer involved in the pro-choice movement. So that's a problem for us as Marxists. Anyone who calls themselves a Marxist is, how do you manifest what I think Anne is rightly argues, that the struggle against women's oppression and for women's liberation has to be central to the work of Marxists. It's half the population, for Pete's sake. It's half of the working class, actually, possibly slightly more in many countries. So that's a problem for Marxism and most Marxist organisations, unfortunately. I would imagine it's a problem for socialists working and Marxists working inside the Labour Party. And I haven't ever worked inside the British Labour Party, but I imagine that it's hardly a bastion of the struggle for women's liberation, particularly with the regime you have at the moment. So I don't know if people want to talk about that, but to what extent do you leftists work in the Labour Party pose this as a central question in your work in the Labour Party? Finish, thanks.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, Anthony, please. Oops, sorry.
I think it's important to understand the issue between oppression and class exploitation. That's very important to understand, because I think we saw with the Me Too movement in America over Harvey Weinstein, That was a turning point like the Black Lives Movement, because the working and middle class women are not going to put up with their oppression anymore. I think we saw that again with the Black Lives Movement. They said in the early stages of America, we put up with 500 years of oppression, and we're not going to put it up with anymore. Of course, some of those of the ruling class are trying to incorporate. I think that murder, what's that woman's name that's been murdered yesterday, or they found the body yesterday? I can't remember her name now. But that is part of the, well, what's going on? The whole capitalist society is degenerating and disintegrating before our very eyes. So that with the scandal in the monarchy has the scandal of this being a police officer, not just a police officer, it's in the diplomatic and the parliamentary courts. So what's going on behind the scenes, we don't fully know. There's all degeneration going on. And that's why ruling class women could be racially and sexually oppressed. So like in the colonies, outside the Stalinists, part of the working class movement, most of the people that fought the imperialists are the bourgeois nationalists. This is some of the complexity of oppression. But Engels always talked about oppression like the patriarchal family and linked it up with class society. Now, the only way you can end class society and all oppression is a working class-led revolution. Unless you've got a program for the, Lenin couldn't have made the revolution uniting the oppressed nationalities, women under the working class. Trotsky drove the Poland Revolution on that basis, and he drove the whole series of demands for black people in the 30s. Positive action in the employment to make sure there's positive discrimination in housing, because with the racism, unless you convince the black workers that you're going to fight against their racism, you can't win them over with the racism. And also you got to stand up with the white chauvinism in the working class, which is like it was like the Ku Klux Klan was some of the most right-wing elements in the trade union movement around the labor aristocracy. That's why I think the social democratic model, because they were degenerating for a long time on sexism, racism, and imperialism and colonialism. The model is Lenin's party of fighting for the oppressed, and the American Socialist Workers' Party before it degenerated in the early 80s. But some of those debates on black nationalism are interesting, because you can have partial transitional demands for the oppressed. For example, on the black question, or for childcare, on abortion rights, women's right to vote, a whole series of democratic, media, and transitional demands, and link it up with the fight for socialism. And that's how the intersectionality can forge those alliances. My mum, first meetings I went to with my mum, she can't come tonight, she's been very ill in the last couple of days. She was involved in the women's support group and the Labour left, and the women's sections played a big role in that in Tamworth in the 80s. My dad was trained in the Canadian Trust, and they drove the free of women. Had linked up with the second wave of feminism, with the Combined Revolution before the American SWP did. They came around the late 60s. My father grew up to the late 50s, because some of the key women activists as they moved to the right in the early 80s, and finally started adapting to the family and things like that. But the ruling class women, although the candidates I said in the comments can lead post-choice and abortion, women's rights, they always stab the women's movement in the back, because they put the ruling class position. Most ruling class elements of the ruling class can break away. But I think you can't confuse the middle class are going to left against racism, sexism, and the working class movement with the ruling class, because that's part of the combined revolution of the oppressed and exploited. It's coming to a head now with the capitalist society degenerating, all the oppression and exploitation, all the struggle of the class coming out.
Can you start winding up, comrade?
It's pointed out to a social side. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, Mary is next. I don't think you have a camera, do you? So, Mary, please. You're unmuted now. We can hear you. Do you want to speak? I think you're unmuted, Mary. Mary? No? Okay, Felicity wants to speak again.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, can you hear me? Lovely. I have a big problem when you speak about the working class, because the working class has changed somewhat. I mean, I don't know how people feel about the use of the 99% versus the 1%, or the 95% versus the 5%. And really, we should be talking about people who earn a salary or earn a wage. I think it is a loaded question, a loaded issue now, working class, because it's so differentiated. I mean, and such a large proportion of society are suffering. That's number one. And number two, the trade unions are some of the most misogynistic groups in society. yet social change is often seen to come from them. I mean, what do the panelists think about that? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, who wants to go first in summing up, Anne or Ben?
And do you think I should say a few things quickly so you can sum up properly? You get the final say, because most of the stuff's been for you. So
go ahead, Ben.
Is that okay? So just quickly on, I think there was only one or two things directed at me, but maybe I'll finish with the question of feminism in history, as it were. First of all, the print run of the Die Gleichheit. I've got you an article by Daniel Guido and another comrade, Cynthia Frencia. 1902, 4,000, 1914, 124,000. That's 124,000 copies every fortnight. And then same time, around 174,000 active women in the SPD organizations, not their sympathizers, but the actual members. You mentioned Babel's book about readership. That's a funny one, because Babel's book was probably the biggest selling book of the time, maybe even, I mean, okay, forget the Soviet Union and their print runs of Lenin, Stalin or whatever, but in terms of that period, Babel's book went through kind of 15 editions and made him actually pretty wealthy. He was able to retire, from party life. He didn't last very long after he stopped doing party life, but he had some money. It sold incredibly well. It was the best read publication of German social democracy, which is an interesting one. I say it sold very well. I think also partly through to the subscribers to the Gleichheit. It was an incredibly well read book. Whether the insights, how they found reflection, etc., that's a different question altogether. Now, just in terms of this question of Marxism, feminism, socialism, all the rest of it, some comrades have asked, well, look, has there ever been, has Marxism ever really contributed to anything in terms of the women's movement? And I think what we're trying to, in our different ways, Anne and I here, and by pointing out all the problems and limitations of these movements, there was actually a way. Yeah, sure, I'll send it to you, Kevin. There was the ideas that underlined Marxism that Anne gave a kind of overview of, in terms of the historic defeat of the female sex and the place of women in capitalist society. They found organizational expression. So it was a time, this was a time when there was no feminism in that sense. If you look at the term, the German term Feminismus, right, on the kind of historical graph, it doesn't really make an appearance around these times. It doesn't exist. Someone said, well, what, wasn't Engels a feminist when he said this? Well, again, it didn't really exist. What you had, as I put in the slides, was a women's movement of bourgeois outlook and composition, which people like Zetkin looked at and said, these people have a very, as Anne used the word, a very sectional, class-based, narrow outlook about what they understand by female liberation. We want universal liberation as social democrats, as Marxists. How do we go about putting some flesh on that idea? How do we go about putting it into practice? And that is the significance, the forgotten significance, if you like, of this movement in its historical context. And I think that's the important thing that as Anne and I dig through these things, that we want to raise up. I think the question of feminism today, clearly we're in an opposite situation in a sense, or maybe even a kind of dialectical return to the early 1900s, because what you have, yes, feminism, if it means that universal equality for all and everyone's equal, then yes, we're all feminists. But the problem is, this has become the common sense view of the establishment to all intents and purposes. Yes, you had the wobble with Trump and all the rest of it, but you look at the people now that peddle this. It's not just Cameron, it's Harris now, Clinton, basically people who represent the ideas of the ruling class and will bomb children in Syria on the basis of feminism. They will bomb women in Afghanistan on the basis of liberating them, right? So we have to be careful with first the historical context and how terms change in meaning. And I think what I would say, I mean, I'm not massively stuck on the feminist term either way, but I am a Marxist, I'm a communist. I need to explain that, right? What I mean by female equality. But what all I would say is, and I thought Alan had a nice one, that actually existing Marxism doesn't do anything on this question. And my point would be this: I agree, but it's a bit more deeper than that. Actually, existing Marxism is a joke. We're not in a situation where we have established political parties that draw on huge audiences and have large publications, etc. And in that sense, it's not that I don't think either Anne or I are saying let's look back at this great past and reconstruct it, because there are all sorts of issues. But Anne's discussed them, I've discussed them. But it's just looking back and say, is there aspects of the revolutionary movement that we can draw on to provide a comprehensive, realizable, and inspiring approach for women's liberation? And I think there are, despite what many bourgeois or establishment feminists would say, there are rich seams to be explored in terms of the revolutionary workers movement. And I think I'll end it there. Just, I thought the one question on women's violence against women was an important one, but I can't remember the comrade who mentioned that. But obviously, check the news over the past few days. There have been enormous gains for women in say, for example, in this country over the past 20, 30 years. But obviously, we still see the kind of horrors that we have this week. So there's obviously a long way to go. But I think the best way to achieve those gains is to, following Zetkin, get women and men organize alongside each other in the workers' movement, in the labor movement, and for struggle for social transformation. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Okay, Anne, please.
Okay. So I'll try to respond as well as I can, but I know that there's like lots of stuff that I won't be able to adequately respond to, and I would like to think that maybe that we can have more of these debates and look at these questions more closely, because I think with the whole question of feminism and Marxism and the relationship between the two, that it's just so underexplored. My argument really is that I want, firstly, because I've gone away and done some of it myself, and I'm glad that Ben and other people, not just Ben, other people, as I mentioned, Daria and Mike Tabor and other people are doing this, is that saying, look, this is our movement, this is what our movement did on this question. This has been largely unknown among the left until recently. This is what it did, warts and all. Like, this is what it was able to achieve, and there were important achievements, and these are the things that held it back. And one of the things that held it back, which I've been very critical about, and it's reflected in the criticisms made by the women leaders at the time, was the male chauvinism, that men did not want women to be leaving home to go to meetings. They didn't want to be dealing with a woman at a meeting. They just did not see women as equals, and that caused a lot of problems. I'm saying that I think that this is still a problem in the left, and that this is something that we need to challenge. Now, obviously, there have been changes, and I recognize that, but I still think that we need to educate men and educate women together to make this our universal project, not just simply the emancipation of women, but the emancipation of women as an integral part of our struggle for a new society, socialism. So, like, just on the question of violence against women, I very much agree. I think it was it Felicity or Esther, maybe
Esther, yeah.
Sorry, my best friend's name is Esther, I should remember. But I think, like, that's something which I feel very strongly about, having had like personal experience, unfortunately, myself, and very serious experiences in my family. It's just a horrible thing to think that you're in danger when you go out on the street to walk home or go somewhere. But what's worse about it often is the way you're treated afterwards. The whole question of violence against women is obviously, to me, it's power relationships, it's the sexualization of women, the sexualization isn't the right word, the kind of, women seen as private property. They're just such, really huge problem. I mean, like, looking at Africa, I represent women who come from Africa. You know, rape in Africa in some countries is systematic, and then you don't go to the police. The police are the last people you go to because the police will rape you. I mean, it's a huge problem. But I think that this problem needs to be confronted both in terms of women getting the economic independence to be able to leave men who abuse them, to not even feel in the first place that they've got to stay there. So we need huge changes in terms of the rights to economic and social rights to housing and all those questions. They need to be connected with them. And also men need to be educated and understand that women are not objects, women are not property. And we kind of have to cure men of that problem as well. You know, I mean, as much as like it repels me, the idea of a man doing something like that, I also know that men in this society have real problems with anger because their own feelings of impotency in this society. And obviously the wife at home is often, or the partner is the person that gets it when they're angry, which is completely wrong and has happened, you know, very frequently during this lockdown. I think that communist papers and socialist papers need to take up and discuss this question now and take a stand on it. And more than just, you know, kind of like a nominal stand, but really, you know, take that question up seriously and look at that question. So I feel very strongly about it, and I agree it's important, and I'm glad you raised it. Just finally, in terms of intersectionality, I haven't got a very fixed view on the question, but I think that the problem with it is, and that's the problem I think with some forms of feminism, is that it's trying to reach an accommodation within today's society rather than trying to break the confines of it. And within that, there are different levels of oppression or forms of oppression. We all have to own our own one. I think that's kind of okay as it goes, and you should recognize when, you know, you're in that kind of position. But I think as a way of making progress on questions, I just feel like it's a dead end. And I feel that what it does is that it creates like a system of oppressions or a victimhood, and that you basically are so busy being concerned not to upset another person that you are going to, you know, like not debate subjects. I just don't think, to me, that it works. I mean, I've seen big arguments on social media in particular between women feminists against working class men on who is the more oppressed, and I just thought, no, it's just ridiculous. Like, the working class needs to be able to take on the struggle for against all oppression, to be the leader of the oppressed, not be arguing are white working class men more oppressed than feminist middle class women. I just think it's really, I feel like it is a dead end. But, you know, I'd be open to a discussion on it, because I think it's, again, a subject that's under discussed. Okay, well, look, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak tonight. I really appreciate it, and I really have enjoyed hearing people's submissions or discussions and points, and we'll think a lot about them. Thanks, comrades.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, comrades. I think that was a really lively discussion, especially on the question of, you know, Marxism, feminism, etc.